Hello class, how's it going? Here we're back at my third video in these series of supplementary video notes, I guess you could say, for your intake and exhaust subjects. So here, again, just to review, we talked about the single plenum design intake, which is good for high RPM ranges, okay, and the dual plenum design intake, which is really good for more lower RPM operating ranges. But there's a section on both of these pictures that I didn't talk about, actually, and you're probably wondering why, and that is the runner section of the diagram, right? And that would be obviously this section here. So the runners, first off, the runners serve as the pathway basically to each cylinder, right? Air gets drawn in to the plenum, and then the runner distributes the air to their according cylinders. But before we talk about the way the intake runner affects the efficiency of how air moves through your cylinder head and through your intake manifold, first we got to talk about a phenomenon known as resonance tuning. So resonance tuning, what is that? If you guys recall, you did the Argo with the animation, which showed the blue pressure waves bouncing back and forth, and it had the green indicating the fresh air charge, and it talked about how, well, a long runner is meant for low RPM, a short runner is going to be good for high RPM. But other than that explanation, right, it didn't really clarify it beyond that. I'll just give you a little bit more information on that right now. Usually there's a lot of math involved, but we don't even have to get into that, okay? I'm just going to give you a very visual and very simple explanation. So first, let's look at this diagram here. All right, here I have a combustion chamber, your spark plug. This is the exhaust side. Don't worry about that just yet. We're going to deal with just the intake side. Okay, so now imagine you have your engine running at a given RPM. Doesn't matter what RPM is. Right? The engine's running. You're going to have a difference in pressure in your intake plenum and a difference in pressure leading up to your inlet valve. Your intake stroke is happening right now. So your intake stroke is happening, which is going to cause atmospheric pressure air to be pushed in to the intake port. Okay, so for the duration of time that your intake valve is open, everything's going to be filling the combustion chamber. So now your piston's on the way up to the compression stroke. So imagine that high velocity air moving through the intake port. All of a sudden, this intake valve shuts off on you, right? It just closes. So what's going to happen is this high velocity air, it's still going to be coming in with some momentum, and it's going to hit now a wall essentially. And what happens is, so the blue denotes the incoming air, and I drew red arrows to denote I guess the reflected air. Air is going to reflect off the back of the valve and just swirl back in a pulse. Okay, so one thing I want you to understand is the energy that's going to be inputted here to the back of that valve. It's going to be bounced back to, let's just say, the wall, which is your throttle plate, and it's going to oscillate back and forth, okay, an X amount of times until that energy is depleted. You see what I'm saying? So a good way to look at it is, don't mind the silly photo. So imagine this is you here, the stick person. You are the intake valve, okay? And this is supposed to be a tennis ball, okay? It's a tennis ball, not a fireball or whatever. It's a tennis ball. You're standing against the wall, okay? Now, if you were to lob the tennis ball towards the wall, okay, at a very low effort, low inertia, you can appreciate the fact that it would bounce back at a slower speed until, well, you caught it again, okay? But now imagine you threw the tennis ball at this wall with a lot of effort, like you threw a fastball at the wall, right? Then you can appreciate when that tennis ball bounces back off the wall, it's gonna reflect back at you at a high rate of speed until eventually it'll deplete. So you remember, if you know that really classic video game like Pong, it's sort of like a game of tennis. Imagine now, after you threw the ball, another wall came out of nowhere, and you created a little two barriers, let's say. That tennis ball would basically bounce back and forth between these two walls until the energy that was inputted into it would deplete. You see what I'm saying, right? Now imagine, instead of a tennis ball, you have air. You have air coming in at a high rate of speed or a low rate of speed, depending on if you're at low RPM or high RPM. you're going to have air coming in at an X amount of speed, velocity. It's going to bounce off, and it's going to go back out, and it's going to bounce back in. It's going to bounce back out, in and out, and in and out, until eventually the energy goes away. And why manufacturers tune or augment the length of the intake runner? They want to time it so essentially, if you are the intake valve, you would want the tennis ball to bounce back towards you when you're ready to catch it, right? So it's the same thing applies. You want the air to come in, bounce off, bounce back off the throttle plate, and you want to time it so that it'll deplete its energy while your intake valve is closed. But the moment your intake valve opens, you would want the air to actually you would want your reflected pulses to complement the airflow coming back at the valve. So it's the same thing as you would basically throw the ball at the wall, and you'd basically want to be ready. You want to be here when the ball bounces back off the wall, and so that you can catch it. So the whole catching part of it would be the same thing as the inlet valve opening for your intake stroke to be ready to take the air charge. You follow me? So what happens is when manufacturers tune your intake runner length, okay, mainly the length, that will affect how many times the air will bounce back and forth. So for instance, you want it to be an even number, for instance, right? They call it like an intake bump, right? So let's say your air bounces off the valve, that would be 1. Then technically you would want the inlet valve to be open at 2 bumps, right? If it was an odd number of bumps, so let's say 1, it would reflect off, 2, and then reflect again, 3, or sorry, let me rephrase that. You would want, if 1, let's say it's 1 going this way, 2 going back, and then 3, it's an odd number, right? You wouldn't want your inlet valve to open during the 3rd bump of your reflected air, because it would be going in the opposite direction and your inlet valve would be opening. So then what happens is incoming air would crash into the outgoing reflected air. You see what I'm saying? So there's a very elaborate equation to determining the length of your intake. That's not important. I just want you guys to understand this principle of why the intake length affects the airflow and the reflected airflow pulse, which is known as resonance tuning. Okay, and some things just to understand. Now we're going to move into the actual construction of the intake runner. Okay, so going back to Bernoulli's theorem, if you wanted an engine to be more efficient, let's say at low RPMs, we mentioned before when we were speaking about let me go back to the other picture now, the dual plenum design, where the split chambered plenum offers more response and the drop in pressure occurs a lot sooner at low RPMs. To facilitate that even further, most of the time to a dual plenum design, longer, more narrow runners are fitted, because if you think about Bernoulli's theorem now, when air moves through a constriction, velocity increases. And by decreasing the overall area of the runner, by actually making it more narrow and making it more longer, you're decreasing the effective area of that runner, which is essentially creating a constriction, and it'll increase velocity and decrease in pressure, which will aid in creating a lower pressure area sooner in the plenum. And on the opposite side, you have a single plenum design. The single plenum design, usually these intake manifolds will be fitted with more large diameter, large area, and shorter runner designs, because at that point it's all about maximizing airflow, volume. You don't need velocity, because at that point the engine is going to be revving at such a high RPM that any restriction in airflow would basically rob the engine of volumetric efficiency. It will rob the cylinder heads from actually obtaining the correct amount of air that it needs to meet engine demands.